Good afternoon. Hope everyone's doing okay today. This is Brown at I Have Brown, and today we are going to be talking about Havok and Wolverine, Meltdown. So this was actually a miniseries that was originally put out in a 4-issue format in the year of 1988. So I was, knee-high to a mud turtle then, couldn't even read comic books. But anyway, though, fast forward several years later, and I remember I found the original miniseries, in the 4-part format at Half Price Books, and I remember checking them out and just being blown away at just how eerie and beautiful the fully painted artwork was in the series, and I thought the story was unique as well because it had a lot more of an adult oriented approach in terms of content and I guess the psychological factor as well. But I think at the time, I'd certainly read a lot of X-Men stuff, but not say the X-Men stuff that took place right before this miniseries, because having since read a good portion of the X-Men books that took place around this time, the emotional mindset of the characters, especially for the character of Havok, makes a lot more sense. And I think in hindsight, that made for a better reading experience when I found the trade paperback of this and got it, and I was like, okay, I definitely appreciate it a lot more now. Not that I didn't like it before, but like while it was definitely a good standalone story, it also works in conjunction with the X-Men stories that came before this one. So anyway, the creative team was a pretty exemplary one, because you had, for the writing duties, you had the husband and wife team of Walt and Louise Simonson, both pretty good writers, and Walt happens to be a good artist in his own right as well. But the artwork was by two artists. Jon J, Muth, who handled the majority of the artwork dealing with Havok, and Kent Williams, who handled the majority of the artwork dealing with Wolverine. And it was a very interesting, collaboration, because oftentimes you'd have the two characters working independently of one another, in which case the artists were generally able to focus on the characters they were assigned to. But every now and then you'd have like a panel or a splash page wherein you have both characters in the same shot. So one of the artists would take over the majority of the artwork for the page, and the other artist would come in and put the character that they were supposed to have. And so I'll show y'all a little bit more of that once we get into it. But yeah, this was actually a pretty good storyline. It was sort of a Cold War espionage story, plus some psychological drama, and just very surreal, dreamlike quality as well, primarily due to the artwork of the story. But so yeah, excuse me. So this particular story actually takes place in a rather tumultuous time in Havok's life, aka Alex Summers, and he had recently gone through a series of losses with two women that he had come to fall in love with. One of them was in fact the love of his life, Lorna Dane, who is also known as the mutant Polaris. Polaris had unfortunately been possessed by an evil mutant, and had while being possessed gone to join a group of evil mutants. And so Havok's obviously upset about that, because that's the love of his life, and she's not in control of herself, and he doesn't know where she is. And then you had Madeleine Pryor, who at one point was the wife of his brother Scott, aka Cyclops from the X-Men. But after having Scott abandoned her, she ended up falling in with the X-Men, and Havok and her formed a relationship of sorts. Not quite as intimate as with him and Lorna, but at the same time there was a deep intimate connection with the two of them. But unfortunately, she was corrupted by demonic forces, as well as forces in the material world as well, namely Mr. Sinister, and that's a story for another time. But in that particular storyline, which was called the Inferno storyline, there was a very tragic outcome, and Madeleine Pryor, after having been corrupted, she ended up dying. And so Alex was not in a very good place. And shortly around that time, there was a storyline in Marvel Comics Presents called Havoc, Pharaoh's Legacy, in which a woman named Lila, who basically came into his life, and the two of them formed a connection. But unfortunately, she herself was tied to an old enemy of his, and she was the would-be leader of the cult of the living Pharaoh. And after she had some of an identity crisis, she ultimately reverted to her true nature, which was a very bloodthirsty sociopath, and who wanted to use Havoc for his energy, because he's able to shoot plasma as a force of energy, as his mutation. But anyway, though, Havoc ended up just being in a very vulnerable state of mind, was just tired of having all this bad stuff happen to him. Essentially ended up leaving her for dead. But trust me, she was someone who probably was not a person that you would want to try saving, especially after having stabbed the person who was trying to help her in the back on more than one occasion, which is what she did to Havoc. So while his action was harsh, it was understandable with his mindset. And that same storyline with the cult of the Pharaohs, Wolverine happened to be involved in the story to an extent, and basically helped to get him out of there. And you get the idea that, having taken all that into account, when this book starts off, you kind of have an idea of why Havok and Wolverine are palling around in Mexico, because basically Wolverine's just taking him on a road trip, trying to help get his mind off of trouble. And but then again, this being an X-Men book, trouble does find them, unfortunately. And so it starts off in Mexico, and and basically there's like a bunch of trouble that comes after them. It starts off with a bar brawl, and then you have people trying to kill them, and then you have basically people from the the KGB, or at least a branch of the KGB, trying to hunt them down, because it turns out that there's a duo of supervillains. One's named Dr. Neutron, and the other one is named Meltdown. And both guys, they ironically they have their base of operations in a mental asylum, and they have their own rooms in there and everything. But make no mistake, they're the leaders of this operation. And it turns out that they're the ones who caused the Chernobyl disaster in Russia, and so it wasn't just human error, at least according to this storyline. And while it was catastrophic, it wasn't quite. It didn't have quite the results that they wanted to, and so they've been trying to find a way to sort of replicate that, and that's where they start looking around, seeing what superpowered characters or individuals they could find to manipulate for their latest scheme. And so, it's interesting because with Dr. Neutron, you kind of get the idea that, I mean, while he's definitely, a criminal mastermind, he's doing this just for kind of the fun of it. He's very wistful, very, he's kind of almost charming in a way. He's kind of like an elderly, grandpa. He's very friendly, but and very affable. But at the same time, make no mistake, he's got an agenda that is not going to benefit the world. As at least outside of Russia. Whereas Meltdown is definitely the more gung-ho, bloodthirsty type. And it turns out that he's actually got a mutation, in which, he's powered by radiation. And so, basically, Chernobyl for him was kind of like the ultimate high up to 11. And so, he's wanting to, along with Dr. Neutron, they're trying to see, in this little game of theirs, if they can replicate the experience. And that's where they decide to focus on the person of Havok, because of his powers. And he's basically like a living battery, and he can actually absorb an insane amount of radiation, and not be harmed by it. That now, granted, he does have his limits, obviously, but considering just how much he can withstand in terms of just energy exposure, they decided to to use him in their latest plan. And so that's when they start sending some of their own mercenaries after him, and by consequence Wolverine, because Wolverine's the one who's brought Havok along on this road trip. And so the two of them are attacked, and they end up both getting taken out, namely by a variant of the bubonic plague, and they end up getting separated. And Wolverine, they're thinking that, I mean, they don't know the extent of his powers, and so they're thinking that he's just going to dry up and die, essentially. But they don't take into account that he's got a healing factor. And so one of the kind of running gags is whenever Wolverine recovers from a seemingly impossible situation, first you got bubonic plague, then you got his hotel being blown up and things like that. Wolverine just keeps coming back even more pissed off every single time. And it's pretty amusing, because you think that these Russian criminals, masterminds would know about the healing factor, but either they didn't know about it or just severely underestimated it. Havok, on the other hand, his deal is a little more intricate. So they bring him into this facade of a hospital, and they have an operative of theirs, a red-haired woman, who, incidentally, 2 out of the 3 women that Havok had, had an emotional relationship with and had, lost. As I mentioned before, 2 out of those 3 women were in fact redheads. And so you got, Quark, who she's masquerading as a doctor by the name of Scarlet, but she's a redhead, and so right away you know that that's going to play with Havok on an emotional level. But it turns out she's actually in this game that these supervillains are playing, she's actually a very skilled operative when it comes to the manipulation of psychology. And so she's basically feeding into Alex's need to be validated and to be sort of loved, if you will, as well as his need to be a protector, because of the women in his life that just seem to either die or be taken away from due to circumstances outside of his control. And so it's a very interesting little mind game there. And one of the interesting things is that they're initially going to try to have her and her medical team subliminally brainwash him via imagery on TVs, but it turns out, due to his mutation, the energy, it's like he can feel it. He can feel that there's something wrong, and so he destroys the TV, in kind of just lashing out in agony. And so that's not something they expected, because they didn't know that because of his mutation that he could pick up on those signals. And so that's when Quark, or Scarlet, has to take a more active role in manipulating him. And so she starts to really get into character and basically lead him on this sort of a wild goose chase, but at the same time there is a end goal, because on one hand, she and her people are trying to convince Havoc that Wolverine's dead, and he's trying to tell them that no, Wolverine's not dead. He has this thing called a healing factor. We need to find him. But at the same time, she's trying to play along, but at the same time have her agenda enforced, to where she's able to bring Havoc along to India, in which the supervillains intend to have this ultimate nuclear meltdown at this power plant. And so but unfortunately, though, things get really complicated for various reasons, because on one hand, Havoc, while he does tend to act rashly at times, he's had enough experience, with manipulation to pick up on the fact that someone is manipulating him, but he doesn't know who. And so while he does come to trust Quark or Scarlet, he's not telling her everything, because he wants to have kind of a card in the game that he can use. And so and that's kind of where Wolverine comes into play, because Wolverine, he's an individual who is very hard to kill, and while this conspiracy is ultimately able to get a hold of him and brainwash him, because unlike Havoc, he doesn't have that mutant energy factor that sort of nullifies their brainwashing capabilities. But since Wolverine doesn't have that, while he does have a healing factor, it doesn't prevent him from being brainwashed. So at one point, they're able to send Wolverine into a kill frenzy, and Havoc is his target, and it's not pretty, the outcome, I mean. But even when that happens, though, I mean, Havoc, he presses on, because when he finds out that there's this nuclear meltdown that's about to happen in India, and that the people who have been stringing him on this whole time might be the ones behind it, he knows that with his power, he's probably the only one who can physically stop it in time. But unfortunately, that's kind of what the villains are wanting him to do. And so so that's the basic gist of the story. I really enjoyed this one because it was a good little espionage story, in the sense that you got this sort of Cold War paranoia going on. I mean, this was written in 1988 after all, but you also find out, I mean, there's a lot of psychological horror when it comes to, say, the devastation that nuclear fallout could cause, and basically why the stakes are so high. And I really liked how you got inside the minds of both Havoc and Wolverine. I mean, two very different characters, but one, you see why they click as well as they do. And even if you hadn't read any of the X-Men comics that took place prior to this, you wouldn't doubt that the two of them were teammates, or comrades in arms, so to speak. And Wolverine at this point in time was kind of a leader of the team, and so him and Havoc, this is where I think they ultimately became closer as friends, and so and it's interesting seeing that rapport as the story goes on, and when they're together. But even when they're separated, you kind of see that rapport still in effect, because neither Wolverine nor Havoc are willing to give up on finding the other. And so, it was really cool because you really bought that these two were, good friends, and, they would go through hell to, try and save one of their own. And so it's not just, hey, you're one of us, I'm coming to get you. It's more like, you're my friend, I'd go through hell for you, that kind of thing. And so that was actually pretty cool to see. But I especially liked how it really, got into, the mindset of Havok, especially with what was going on in his life at the time. In my previous review of Havok, Pharaoh's Legacy, I talked about how you caught a glimpse of, that same idea in that story. And, they did a pretty good job with it, I think. But I think that they weren't able to explore it as much as, say, either they would have liked or we, the readers, would have liked, simply because of the format of, the storyline. It was an 8-page, because it was like in a, multiple 8-page chapters, so you can't really do as much, from an emotional standpoint usually on something like that. But in this case, though, you had, a full, four full-length, books in this one, and you basically got to play a lot more, or I should say the creative team got to play a lot more with, what make the characters tick, and they really got to explore, what Havok was going through. And also they took advantage of, the fact that this was in an imprint epic, which was geared towards an older audience. And so, a lot of the psychological stuff, while not necessarily mature readers only, it is a lot more adult oriented. So, I found it a lot more relatable than, say, something in the ordinary mainstream. Not to knock it or anything like that, but you compare, reading an ordinary X-Men book to reading something like this, and yeah, this one, is a lot more rewarding from a psychological standpoint. But I did like, how you saw how Alex was still, in mourning more or less, but at the same time, he was trying to, play along with Wolverine, and, even making bets as to, okay, which one of us can go the longest without using our powers, if we get into a fight, that kind of thing. It's a little, humor like that. And so, Havok, unfortunately ends up being the one to use his power first, and so basically the loser has to buy the beer, and that comes into play at the end of the story. But anyway, though, so yeah, it's just, so you see how he's trying to play along with Wolverine, but he's not in denial that, he's still upset about all that's happened to him. And so when he's in this situation where this, new woman comes into his life, I mean, he's all sorts of confused, because of the situation that happened of, how he and Wolverine ended up, getting into that situation in the first place, and how he's supposedly dead, according to what everyone's telling him. But at the same time, he's falling hook and line sinker, for what she's telling him. He's falling for her agenda. I mean, she is good at her job, but at the same time, he's not totally naive in the sense that, he's not able to eventually pick up on the fact that there are bigger forces at work that, have their own game plan. And so while he's playing along with that, he's also trying to leave, little breadcrumbs for, Wolverine, or, maybe even the X-Men, to tag along and, try and find, just on the off chance that, hey, this is something that, is bigger than I can handle. And so it's kind of a repeat of, in that respect, it's similar to Havok, Pharaoh's Legacy, but at the same time, he's a lot more assertive, and he's trying his best to not let events dictate, his actions. But even though in this case, he kind of, he does it to the best of his abilities, but unfortunately he is still being manipulated. So, it's sort of like, give and take in that respect. But still, though, the fact that, Alex was, you actually got to see some maturity on his part, in the sense of, just, trying to, figure out what he can on the situation, but at the same time, while getting closer to, Quark, or Scarlet as he knows her. And speaking of the character Scarlet, I really liked her character because, I mean, initially she seems, kind of, femme fatale and what have you, in the sense that she's beautiful and sexy, but she's also, manipulative, and she's definitely on the side of the bad guys. But, as she gets, deeper into this, persona of Scarlet, she actually starts to develop feelings for Havoc. And so as a result, the line between, reality and fiction, at least as far as, in her mind, starts to get blurred, and she actually starts to fall in love with him. And so, it was like a more satisfying, take, on the Lila situation from Pharaoh's Legacy. But in this case, from the pure psychological standpoint, it was a lot more satisfactory because you really saw her in inner conflict, both, through the writing as well as, some of the artwork, excuse me, because there'd be some silent moments where, she'll be like sitting down and, she'll be on one hand, leaving a dress behind, for Wolverine to find, just to basically, try and, throw them off, their tracks. But at the same time, when she does something like that, she'll just kind of be looking in the mirror and sort of, breaking down, crying, because it's like she's really conflicted. She loves Alex, or she's come to love Alex, but at the same time, she has her part to play in this game. And so, not quite, I mean, she was definitely a villain, but at the same time, she wasn't just, at least as far as this particular story was concerned, she ended up not being straight up evil. Like, there was a lot of ambiguity there, and I liked seeing that. And speaking of villains, the characters of Dr. Neutron and Meltdown were very intriguing characters because both the individuals were clearly very intelligent, very cunning and crafty, but they're also very different from one another. Dr. Neutron, a lot more laid back and affable, whereas Meltdown was more kill, I must feed, because he's, he gets high off of radiation, more or less. But anyway, though, I did like those two characters because I liked how, on one hand, they were definitely the ones that were ultimately behind, the Chernobyl disaster. But at the same time, though, I mean, as powerful and as deadly as they are, it's like they sort of see life itself as a farce, hence why they willingly stay in this mental asylum, because it's like, hey, to them, the insane asylum is a lot saner than the real world. And so, very intriguing characters, but very evil characters, but you enjoy, checking them, you enjoy seeing them in action, in this little chess game that they're playing. And it's literally a chess game that they're playing. So, but yeah, very, very intriguing villains. Also, the other thing I liked about it was, when it comes to the violence in this book, I mean, it's definitely, you can tell it's made for an adult audience because, I mean, amongst other things, when Wolverine uses his claws on someone, he does not hold back. I mean, you see people get stabbed, you see, claws going through someone's head. I mean, it's pretty brutal, very bloody. And, I was surprised. I remember the first time I read this, I was like, whoa, But then at the same time, though, I mean, I was so glad to see something like that because, I mean, it's like oftentimes in the mainstream comic books, I mean, yeah, you see Wolverine using his claws, but, it's either up against someone who's not a straight up human being, and so basically, yeah, you can get away with slaughtering them, like, say, a cyborg or something like that, or a robot. But other times, though, if he does use his claws, either they cut back just a little bit, to where maybe it's in the shadows, or you just see a little bit of blood to where you get what's going on, but they still, it's like, hey, this is a code-proof book, we gotta play it clean, guys. But here, though, nah, you see it all its glory. And in a way, that also applies to, Havoc's capabilities as well, because in the comics that he was in, he would be, using his powers, basically to, throw villains back, blast them, that kind of thing. But here, though, he'll be, because he's being manipulated, there are times where he, lashes out with a lot more intensity, and you see just how scary, his power can be when he's just, lost it, that kind of thing. And you also see him at times being inventive with his powers. Like, instead of, using his blasts to go straight through, there'll be times where he, say, uses that energy to go under the floor and to the other side of a wall, that's, in his way, that kind of thing, like to get a door open, that kind of thing. So, pretty resourceful in that regard. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like the blood and gore, though, that definitely, falls into Wolverine's side of things, and it's a bloody mess, and I loved it. But yeah, so this was a really cool book. It was very, thought provoking at times, and it was an enjoyable, read. It was definitely, a nice, spotlight story on, Havok and Wolverine, but it wasn't just like throw in Wolverine for, money grabs. It was like, hey, these two played well with one another, and that was in part due to a really good creative team. And so and Havok, I think really came into his own here. And in fact, later on, he would, be one of the leaders of a team called X Factor, and when Peter David was writing the book. And so, or the X Factor book, I mean. And so, it's really interesting, like seeing, his genesis as a more assertive individual kind of, taking shape here. Granted, he is being manipulated here, but he's had enough experience with that to where he's, being more proactive about things. And so I really liked how you saw that side of his character. But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and give, Havok and Wolverine Meltdown 5 out of 5 stars. This was an excellent book. And just as a bonus, I'll just, show y'all some of the artwork here. But yeah, so like, right here, this is where, Muth, is drawn as painted Havok, and you see Kent Williams, and his take on Wolverine right there. And then you got splash page. So I think a lot of this was Muth's art, but then, you had Wolverine, and that was Kent Williams taking over. And let's see, like when the way, Havok's using his power right there, very psychedelic look as with the painted artwork. And then let's see, and I liked how, Kent Williams gave Wolverine sort of a haggard, sort of beer-bellied drunk look, but, make no mistake, he, and just because, he's a very grotty individual, at least, how he's painted here, it doesn't make him any less deadly, Case in point. But, so yeah, very, very different art styles. And, oh, okay, remember I was saying how, Scarlet or Quark was very beautiful, very sexy. Just look at this right here. Beautiful artwork. I love that. Sort of like almost like a goth look. But yeah, so very expressive. But there's just so much to look at here. A lot of surreal art. It sort of looks like a cross between, I don't know, like something you'd see in a heavy metal magazine and maybe something from, H.R. Geiger's work or something like that. But, yeah, so this was, really neat. I was hoping I could find I was trying to find a picture of Meltdown, because, he was actually a very unique villain, but it's Meltdown in the flesh. Kind of looks like, Marlon Brando with jaundiced skin. But anyway, though, yeah, it's yeah, a lot of beautiful artwork to look at. It's a good story to read. So yeah, if you're a fan of X-Men, definitely check out Havok and Wolverine Meltdown. If you're a fan of either of those two characters, especially Havok, it's definitely worth picking up, and you won't be disappointed. And if you're someone who just kind of likes to get lost in the artwork and find, I guess, meaning in it, I mean, it's definitely worth just worth it just to look through the book, just to look at the pictures, But it's very expressive, very beautiful, and speaking of Havok and having a harsher look when it comes to using his powers. I mean, that just looks straight up terrifying to me. Like, as far as, just him being out of control, But, yeah. Sorry, one more thing. Yeah, I promised y'all some blood and gore. And here we go. Yeah, that's Havok getting slashed in the face. But anyway, yeah, this was a good read. Thank y'all very much for taking the time to check out my review. I hope y'all enjoy it. Y'all got any questions, comments, let me know. And if you like what you see here, please hit that like button and subscribe. Thank y'all very much. Bye.